There were only a few hours left until the end of my shift. Exhausted, I was almost dreaming of rest and the peace that would soon come. This was my last night shift in the emergency room, but even that thought couldn't calm me. It felt like years of fatigue and anxiety had accumulated deep inside, turning into an invisible weight that pressed down harder each day. I constantly had this strange feeling like I'd missed something or done something wrong, but I couldn't find an explanation for this unease, blaming it on chronic sleep deprivation and constant stress. Near the end of the shift, they brought in a new patient, and I felt an odd premonition. The sight of him only deepened my anxiety. He was an elderly man, easily over 80, and looked as if time had passed him by, leaving only a thin, pale body and dry, papery skin like that of a mummy. His eyes were dull and empty, as though he'd long lost the ability to see, yet they showed no pain or fear, only a strange, almost grim acceptance. It was a look that was unforgettable, dead and alive at the same time, as if those eyes could see right into my soul. "What's your name?" I asked, trying to establish some connection, but he remained silent. The old man kept staring at me, unblinking, as if he knew something I didn't. His gaze made me feel uneasy, but work was work. I moved closer to check his condition when suddenly he grabbed my hand. His fingers were ice cold, and the touch was so unexpected and unpleasant that I had to make an effort not to pull away. His grip felt stronger than I'd expected, and he pulled me closer, whispering in a barely audible voice, "Do you hear them? They're always here with us." Those words were so close and sharp that I shuddered and instinctively looked around, but the room was empty. Silence cloaked us in a heavy, dead stillness. I wanted to ask someone to cover for me, but something kept me rooted there. It felt as if his grip held not just my hand, but my mind as well. I looked at him again, trying to understand what he meant, but he was no longer looking at me. The old man was staring into space, as if through the hospital's walls and ceiling, and whispered almost lifelessly, "They'll come for you too." I barely had time to grasp the meaning of his words when the monitor showed a flat line. The old man had died. At that moment, a chilling fear crept over me, as if the shadow of death itself had brushed against me, leaving coldness and silence in its wake. I thought these words would soon fade, that they'd remain just a strange episode in the long series of night shifts, but I was wrong. They seemed to imprint on my mind a dark whisper, a raspy voice, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd left something behind, something that followed me even after I left his room. From that day on, work began to take on a sinister tone. The hospital corridors, so familiar, suddenly seemed longer and darker. Occasionally, faint rustling sounds could be heard behind the ward doors, sounds I hadn't noticed before, as if someone was hiding there in the darkness, watching my every move. My colleagues didn't notice anything unusual, but I felt something had changed, as though after this old man's death, an invisible shadow had settled in the hospital. A few days later, I needed to go down to the morgue. Inside, a muted tension seemed to awaken, as if something cold and alien had stirred within me. As I walked through the cold corridors, I felt goosebumps rising on my skin. Suddenly, I noticed something strange. One of the refrigerators where bodies were stored slowly opened on its own, as if someone was holding it from inside. My heart stopped when I saw the door creak open again, the light flickering, and for a second it seemed like I glimpsed a shadowy figure standing behind the door. But it could have been a trick of the eye. I was too tense, exhausted, and I brushed it off as fatigue and poor health. But even after I returned to the ward, that tension didn't leave me, as if someone's shadow continued to follow me. I didn't know how to explain this fear, which only grew stronger as night deepened. That same evening, when I finally returned home, it felt like all the eerie sensations I'd experienced in the hospital had somehow followed me. The first thing I heard was a barely audible rustling in the corridor, as if someone was moving there, staying out of sight. And though I tried to convince myself that it was all just my imagination, the feeling of a foreign presence became clearer and clearer, filling every corner of my apartment until it was overflowing. Later, I began noticing small things, going missing: my keys, my phone, or books ending up in odd places. But worse were the lights starting to flicker, as though someone was inviting me to play a terrible game. I could hear strange sounds, the creak of floorboards, quiet steps outside my door, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I would no longer find peace here. When the anxiety became unbearable, I realized I could no longer live within these walls. Even sleeping had become impossible. Every creak would make me open my eyes, listening to the night's silence, reassuring myself that no one was waiting behind the door. Every night felt like an eternity, and when I finally understood that I could no longer stay in this house or even in this city, I had to make a decision. I packed my things, resigned from the hospital, and left the city. I had to change my place of residence, my job, and leave everything behind in the hope that the nightmares and shadows would stay where I'd first encountered them, in the emergency room, in the dead eyes of the old man who had prophesied doom for me. When Anna Maxwell first entered my office, I knew right away this would be a long, difficult case. Her eyes were empty, void of spark, her face worn, and her movements slow, as if each step was a struggle. Anna suffered from deep depression and had gone through countless rounds of treatment and therapies, but nothing seemed to work. She looked as though she'd resigned herself to hopelessness. This wasn't new to me as a psychotherapist. I'd seen cases like this before. But with Anna, something felt different. An inexplicable heaviness hung in the air, and I sensed it immediately. Her despair ran so deep that when I suggested trying a new treatment, she almost instantly agreed. The method was experimental, but I felt confident in its effectiveness. A neuropsychological technique that used mental anchors to link traumatic memories with neutral or positive emotions. The idea was to reframe traumatic memories in a way that made them less frightening. The first session went smoothly. I guided Anna into her subconscious, carefully surfacing memories that had caused her pain. We created new associations, and it seemed to work. At one point, I noticed her face relaxing, as if the weight of years was finally lifting. I saw a faint, genuine glimmer of relief, and I felt satisfied with our progress. When she left that first session, I was sure we were on the right track, but exactly a week later, Anna returned, and this time she was a different woman. She looked exhausted, her eyes red and swollen, as if she hadn't slept in days. "Doctor, something's wrong," she whispered, her voice barely audible but full of fear. Her words sent chills down my spine. "Since we started therapy, I've been having nightmares. The same one, over and over." Cautiously, I asked her to describe the dream, and she began to speak, her voice trembling. She told me of a dark hallway stretching endlessly. She could feel she wasn't alone. Someone or something was waiting at the end. Her hands gripped the armrests tightly, and I could tell the fear from that shadow had started to haunt her in the waking world as well. Trying to sound reassuring, I told her that it was a normal reaction. This new therapy could trigger vivid memories and intense feelings. I assured her that it would pass in a few days and the nightmares would subside. Anna looked doubtful but nodded anyway. She was relying on me, and I tried to project confidence. I had no idea that things were about to spiral out of control. A few days later, she called me again, her voice filled with panic, and I insisted on seeing her immediately. When Anna returned to my office, I barely recognized her. Her eyes were empty, like something within her had truly broken. "The nightmares, they're worse," she murmured, as if struggling to speak. "It's no longer just dreams. Every night, I feel someone standing next to my bed. I hear breathing, but when I open my eyes, there's no one there. That hallway, it's everywhere now, even when I'm awake. I feel like it's becoming real." Her words chilled me to the bone, but I kept my composure, or at least I tried to. "Anna," I said, clearing my throat, "sometimes traumatic images surface as we begin treatment. Your mind might be resisting the change, clinging to the familiar pain as a safety mechanism. Let me guide you through another session to set this right." She hesitated but agreed. This time her resistance was much stronger than before, and it quickly became clear that something was wrong. I tried to gently guide her through the process, but suddenly she started to thrash in her chair, her breathing ragged, her face contorted in terror. "He's coming for you, doctor," she shrieked, staring at me with wild terror. "Now he's seen you." Her words struck me with a primal fear. A wave of dread rose in my chest, and suddenly the room seemed darker. I thought I caught a glimpse of a shadow in the mirror on the wall. I shook my head, trying to dispel the feeling, but I couldn't shake the sense that someone was watching me. That night was pure torment. As soon as I closed my eyes, I found myself in that same dark hallway Anna had described, long, winding, and shrouded in blackness. As I walked forward, I could feel something behind me, but I couldn't turn around, as if some primal instinct warned me that if I looked, everything would end. The next morning, I awoke drenched in cold sweat, but I dismissed it as stress. I tried to convince myself it was just a reaction to Anna's story, nothing more, but it didn't end there. The nightmare returned the next evening, only now the shadowy figure was closer, as if it was emerging from the depths of the hallway, from within the darkness itself. I awoke in terror and couldn't fall back asleep for the rest of the night. Toward the end of the week, Anna called me once more. Heart racing, I picked up, but there was only silence on the other end, faint whispers like someone murmuring in the background. After that, I never heard from Anna again. Her phone went dead, and when I went to her apartment, her neighbors told me she'd left in the night and hadn't returned. Days passed, but the nightmares persisted. I could no longer work. I couldn't look my patients in the eye because I saw the same fear in them that now lived inside me. I submitted my resignation, thinking I needed time to recover, but nothing helped. Every night, I was trapped in that endless hallway, sensing that dark figure drawing closer and closer. I stopped leaving the house, and my nights became torturous. One night, I awoke to the sound of breathing beside my bed. I was too scared to turn, but eventually I forced myself to open my eyes. In the corner of the room stood a shadow, its form barely visible in the dim light. It didn't move. It just watched me until I closed my eyes, praying it was only a dream. But when I opened my eyes again, it was closer. Now I don't know where reality ends and the nightmare begins. Working as a security guard in an abandoned hospital had become a routine for me. I knew every corner of this old building, its dilapidated corridors and empty wards. In a small American town, this place had long been considered cursed, and the locals avoided it. Every day I entered this silence, filled with shadows and mysteries, but never once did I think that this night would change everything. I started my shift as usual, only pausing for a moment to consider that I could find a more peaceful job. The first few hours passed in the usual manner. I patrolled, checked doors, and listened to the sounds that grew louder. Every rustle in this emptiness felt like a distant echo of fear hidden deep within the building. As midnight approached, the silence was only interrupted by occasional sounds, a slight crackle, as if the building was breathing, or the faint jingling of glass. I tried to focus on my thoughts, but suddenly I felt a chill run down my spine. I turned around, but there was no one behind me. In that moment, a thought flashed through my mind. What if I'm not alone? Hours passed, and my anxiety only grew. I did another round and stumbled upon an open door of one of the wards. I was sure I had closed it. Stepping inside, I noticed that someone had left an old medical file on the table. I picked it up and I was struck by its contents. These were notes about patients with severe mental disorders, detailing the inexplicable phenomena they experienced. Reading it was like a sinister whisper penetrating my consciousness. And then, in the silence, a sound erupted. Quiet, barely perceptible, but so familiar. As if someone was calling my name. I paused, listening. It was a mumble that only heightened my panic. I dropped the file and rushed out of the ward, leaning against the cold wall, trying to comprehend what was happening. I decided to check the corridor, but it was filled with oppressive silence. With every step, I felt my fear grow, as if the very air around me was thickening. Suddenly, I heard footsteps. They were close. I froze, my heart pounding as if it wanted to leap out of my chest. I couldn't turn around, not knowing what awaited me there. The footsteps stopped, and complete silence fell. I took a deep breath and turned. Nothing. The corridor was empty, but I was haunted by the feeling that someone was watching me. I quickened my pace, and again I heard the mumbling. It was getting louder, and I realized I could no longer stay there. I stepped outside again to catch my breath and calm down, but the air was cold and the night sky was filled with clouds, as if a storm were approaching. I closed my eyes, trying to push away the thoughts of what was happening inside the hospital. I needed to leave. This wasn't normal. However, standing outside, I noticed that the hospital seemed to beckon me back, as if the building itself was waiting for me to return. I remembered my responsibilities and, relying on my courage, I stepped inside again. But this time I was ready. I knew someone was here with me. I headed towards the main gates, but they were locked. Why? I whispered, trying to calm myself. I decided to walk through the corridors again, hoping to find another exit. But every place felt foreign, and I was getting lost in this maze. Footsteps echoed behind me, and I couldn't tell if they were following me or if it was just a trick of my mind. With each passing minute, my fear grew. I heard soft whispers that wouldn't stop. I stumbled into an office and closed the door, as if shielding myself from an invisible enemy. Anger and fear swelled within me. Is this all just in my head? I thought. I sat on the floor, covering my head with my hands. But then I heard it, his voice. I knew it was impossible, but it sounded so close. It whispered to me as if it knew all my fears and secrets. You won't leave here. You have nowhere to run. I jumped up, madness overtaking me. This was something more than just fear. It was a feeling of complete hopelessness. I dashed towards the exit, but faced closed doors once again. I felt panic grip me as I turned and saw a reflection in the glass. There was me, but something in that face had changed. It was a face full of fear and despair. I threw myself at the window, but it was locked. Then I remembered the stairs leading to the attic. I raced up there, knocking everything in my path aside. Every step was a battle with my own fear. I reached the attic, and there, among old things, I found a window that looked like a way out. I opened it and felt the fresh air. But before I could take a step, a familiar whisper came from behind me. You can't leave. I won't let you. I felt my throat tighten, and that sensation became the last. I jumped through the window, but my mind still lingered in the hospital. My life changed. I moved to another town, leaving all memories of that night behind. But every time the night blankets the town, I hear his voice, reminding me that I will never escape this fear. That night, I woke up suddenly, startled by a noise as if something heavy had been dropped in the kitchen. My heart pounded in my chest, and for a few seconds, I couldn't understand what was happening. The house was too quiet, even for this place. I lay in the darkness, straining to hear every sound, and suddenly caught a barely audible noise, a door creaking downstairs. It was slow and cautious, like someone trying to move silently. A chill ran through me. I was sure I had locked the door before going to bed. I had moved into this house a week ago. It was old but cozy. The floorboards creaked under even the lightest step, and the walls groaned with each movement. At first, it was unsettling, but soon these sounds became part of the nightly silence, especially during cold autumn nights when the wind beat against the windows and howled through the chimney. Sleep had left me entirely, replaced only by fear and a clear sense of what was happening. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, but the screen remained black. Its battery had died. Lying in the dark, I tried to convince myself that it could have been a draft, but the footsteps below shattered any remaining doubts. Someone was inside the house. I sat up in bed, trying to make no noise, feeling cold sweat trickling down my back. What should I do? If it were just a burglar, I might scare him off with noise. But at that moment, it felt like this intruder wasn't merely looking for something to steal. There was something unnaturally deliberate in those steps, as if he was relishing what was happening. Cautiously, I approached the bedroom door and cracked it open. The hallway was shrouded in darkness, lit only by the faint moonlight filtering through dusty window panes. The footsteps had stopped, but I knew that the person downstairs was still nearby. I carefully crept toward the stairs and peeked into the living room. There, near the window, stood a stranger. His silhouette was barely discernible in the dim glow of a nightlight. He was rummaging through my belongings, methodically placing them into a backpack. I froze, trying not to reveal my presence, but my heart pounded in my chest like a drum. The man suddenly paused and lifted his head, as if sensing that someone was watching him. I darted back into the shadows of the hallway, trying to breathe as quietly as possible. It felt like he could hear every breath, every heartbeat. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to figure out what to do next. Should I hide or try to escape? But the escape plan vanished when I heard his footsteps again. He was coming up the stairs slowly and cautiously, like a hunter who knows his prey is near. I dashed into the nearest room, an old storage closet under the stairs where I had stashed boxes. Locking myself inside, I tried to keep my breathing steady, making no sound. Soon, the footsteps halted right outside the door. I heard him pause and listen. The door handle turned slowly, but the door didn't budge. I had blocked it from the inside. He jiggled the handle a few more times, then, abandoning the attempt, he stepped back. I heard him muttering under his breath, "Where are you? Where are you hiding?" Then the footsteps moved away. I couldn't tell if he had left or was just lurking nearby, so I stayed put, trying to remain calm. But after a few minutes, I heard him again. This time in another room. He opened every door in the house, checked closets, peered under beds, and searched through storage spaces. I started to think that he would soon discover my hiding place. I needed to move while he was in another part of the house. Gathering my courage, I quietly opened the closet door and slipped into the hallway. As I passed by the bedroom, I caught a glimpse of his shadow flickering in the mirror, reflecting part of the living room. My heart clenched with fear when he suddenly stopped and turned in my direction. I bolted up the stairs to the attic. My hands shook as I struggled to open the hatch, but it finally gave way. I climbed up into the attic and slammed the hatch shut behind me, holding my breath. I knew this wouldn't hold him for long, but it bought me some time. From my hiding spot, I could hear him resume his search. His voice grew louder as he began speaking aloud, as if savoring the situation. "Think you can hide from me? I'll find you." The attic was cluttered with old, dust-covered things, and I hid behind several boxes, trying to blend into the surrounding darkness. Minutes passed, but it felt like an eternity. Then I heard him climb the stairs to the attic. The hatch creaked open with a loud groan, and for a moment the attic was bathed in the dim light from his flashlight. He slowly scanned the attic, pointing the beam into every corner until it lingered on the boxes where I was hiding. I froze, hoping the shadows were deep enough to conceal me. But the light suddenly halted, then slowly began to move toward me. I felt my legs buckle with fear, but at the last moment an unexpected noise from downstairs distracted him. It was my old alarm system, which inexplicably began to blare. The man turned his head, frustration clear in his eyes. He hurried downstairs, leaving the attic in darkness. I seized the moment, rushed to the hatch, closed it, and blocked it with an old metal bar. My head spun from fear, but I knew I had to hold out until morning. With the bar in place, the hatch wouldn't open easily, and I hoped the man would decide to leave, realizing he couldn't achieve what he wanted. I stayed on the attic floor until dawn, listening intently for any noise below, but I heard no more footsteps, no voice. It was as if he had never been there at all. When the first rays of sunlight filtered through the windows, I dared to go downstairs. The house was silent and empty. My things were scattered, and the marks on the floor confirmed that this was no figment of my imagination. I called the police, but when they arrived, they found no trace of the intruder. Yet I knew he had been there, that he had been trying to find me. Maybe I was just a toy in his nightmarish game. Now, I live with the constant fear that one night, as I lie in bed, I'll hear that whisper outside the door again, the soft footsteps and the creak of the handle. And then I won't be sure if I can escape this time. When my parents announced they'd be away for the entire night visiting friends, I was thrilled. Finally, my friend Mike and I could hang out without any adults watching over us. We planned a night of movies, pizza, and, of course, all the jokes we could come up with when no one was around to stop us. As they left, my parents reminded me, as always, to lock all the doors and not to make too much noise before closing the door behind them. Mike arrived right after they left with a bag of chips and a bottle of Pepsi. We took everything to the kitchen and started chatting about what we'd do. Movies, video games, arguing over who the best football player was. All of it was fun, but soon we craved something more exciting, something that could really add a thrill to the night. "Hey," Mike said, biting his lip and narrowing his eyes playfully, "what if we try to summon some kind of demon? Just for kicks, you know. Maybe record it on our phones and post it online. Get some views." I rolled my eyes, but the idea was too tempting to dismiss outright. We pulled out our phones, searching for something like how to summon a demon at home, and started reading through articles and comments where people joked about various rituals. All the instructions seemed silly and ridiculous. Draw a circle with salt, recite this ancient incantation, light some candles. "Let's try this one," I suggested, laughing. "It's supposed to summon some benevolent spirit that grants wishes. What do you think? Should we give it a shot? Mike laughed and agreed. We turned off the kitchen lights and lit a single candle. It all felt completely ridiculous. I drew a salt circle on the floor, trying not to chuckle, while Mike began whispering some gibberish incantation, attempting to make his voice sound mysterious. It was all just a game until it got genuinely creepy. As soon as Mike finished his playful words, the candle suddenly flickered and went out. We both froze, surprised by the sudden darkness that engulfed the kitchen. Of course, I immediately thought of logical explanations, maybe a draft, maybe the air, but my heart still raced. We turned the lights back on and saw that the salt circle on the floor had been disturbed, as if someone had lightly scattered it, though I was certain neither of us had gone near it after finishing the ritual. "All right, that's enough of this nonsense," Mike said with a nervous laugh. "Let's just watch a movie or something." We headed to the living room, trying to pretend that nothing strange had happened. But I noticed that Mike glanced over his shoulder as he walked down the hallway, and I could feel a slight tension in the air myself. We turned on the TV and started watching a movie, but the sound seemed oddly muffled, as if the walls of the house had thickened. Things got even stranger when we heard rustling in the hallway. It could have been anything, old, creaky house noises. But the footsteps we heard behind the wall were too clear, like someone moving across the floor in socks, carefully, almost silently. "Did you hear that?" I asked, hoping Mike would brush it off with something like, "Nah, it's just the pipes." But he looked at me with the same tension I felt, unable to come up with an explanation. We fell silent, listening to the sounds. The footsteps stopped, but something had shifted in the atmosphere of the house. The sense of light-hearted fun was gone, leaving only unease behind. "Hey, what if someone got into the house?" Mike muttered, lowering his voice to a whisper. "Are you sure all the doors are locked? I checked before they left. Everything was locked." We decided to check to make sure all the doors and windows were secure. As we walked down the hallway, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. We reached the back door and froze. The door was slightly open. We were certain it had been locked, but now a gap in the doorway stared at us like a black void leading into the night. "This isn't funny anymore," Mike whispered. "We need to call the police." I nodded and reached for my phone, but Mike quickly stopped me. "Let's close the door first. Keep it quiet. Who knows, he might still be inside." I crept towards the door slowly, trying not to make any sudden movements. Just as I reached out for the handle, something flickered in the darkness outside. I slammed the door shut in terror and locked it tight. We returned to the living room, trying to figure out what to do next. Mike said he thought he heard someone going up the stairs, but I hadn't heard anything. We tried to convince each other that it was all in our heads, but deep down we both knew someone was in the house. We could feel it, and then came the creak on the staircase, slow and deliberate. It wasn't the sound of our steps or the old wood. It was something else, coming from someone moving slowly up the stairs. Mike grabbed a kitchen knife and I did the same. We hid in a corner of the living room, listening to the footsteps getting closer. I tried to hold my breath, but the sense of someone approaching overwhelmed me with fear. The footsteps stopped directly above us on the second floor, and then everything went quiet again. We stood in complete silence, too afraid to move. Then Mike whispered into my ear, maybe we should try to escape through the backyard. But then we heard a soft whisper coming from the staircase. It was a cold, unclear voice, saying something incomprehensible. It seemed to relish our fear. We ran back to the door, but just as we reached it, there was a creak from above. Someone had started descending again. This time faster, more confidently. We rushed back to the living room and hid inside a closet, trying not to make a sound. Through the crack of the closet door, I saw a shadow move across the living room. The figure slowly circled the room, pausing by the window, then moving towards the door. We held our breath, praying it wouldn't hear us. But it seemed to sense our presence. I saw it stop in front of the closet, its breathing growing louder. It slowly reached for the door, but just then, a noise came from outside, the sound of my parents' car alarm. The figure flinched, then quickly disappeared from the living room. We stayed hidden in the closet, not daring to come out. When my parents returned and found us trembling in the closet with knives in our hands, we couldn't immediately explain what had happened. The police they called didn't find any signs of a break-in, except for the back door being open. But I still feel like that person is out there somewhere watching me from the shadows when I'm alone, and every creak in the night makes me relive that terrifying night all over again. Liza and I had always dreamed of owning our own home. When we finally had the chance to buy a small old house on the outskirts of town, it felt like a gift from fate. The house seemed perfect. Wooden walls, a spacious garden, and a quiet neighborhood. The owner sold it for an unexpectedly low price, but we didn't think twice. We were too caught up in our dream. And why would we have any doubts? Our first night was spent among boxes, without furniture, on a mattress spread out right in the living room. It was a quiet, cozy evening, and we drank wine, enjoying the feeling that this was finally our home. But even then I noticed that Liza kept glancing at the windows as if something was bothering her. "Did you hear something?" I asked, trying to hide my irritation. She just shook her head and forced a smile. "No, I just imagined it. I guess I'm still not used to the new place. Maybe it's just the old house, creaking." I chuckled, not giving her words much thought. But even then, I felt a slight chill run down my spine. The second night was worse. Liza woke up in the middle of the night and shook me awake, her eyes wide open, her breathing erratic. "I heard a voice," she whispered, clutching my hand. A woman's voice. She was calling my name. I listened, but there was only dead silence around us, with just the wind whispering through the tree branches outside. I hugged her and tried to calm her down, but a troubling thought flashed through my mind. Liza was never easily spooked. She was always the skeptic, and her panic worried me. That night, neither of us managed to fall back asleep. Days went by, but the house didn't feel any more welcoming. Liza became more withdrawn, often locking herself in the bedroom with the curtains drawn, avoiding the sunlight. I tried to support her, assuring her that she just needed rest, that all this was just stress from the movie. But I, too, began noticing strange things. Footsteps in the hallway that would stop whenever I went to check. Cold patches of air in the most unexpected places. A knocking in the walls that seemed to come from within. One night, when I woke up to find Liza not in bed, I found her in the living room. She was standing in front of a large mirror left by the previous owners, staring into emptiness. "Liza?" I called out, but she didn't respond. I walked closer, and finally she turned to me. Her face was blank, as if all emotion had drained out, leaving only a shell behind. "She doesn't want us to live here," Liza whispered. I shuddered. "Who is she, Liza? This is nonsense." "Look, you're just exhausted." But Liza didn't take her eyes off the mirror. "The woman who lived here before us. She can't leave. She's here, and she hates me." That was the end of our conversation. Liza went back to bed, leaving me alone in the living room. I felt a mix of anger and helplessness. The house that was supposed to be our refuge was turning into a nightmare. The next day, I decided to learn more about the house's past. At the local library, I found an article about a woman who had lived there before. Her name was Marina, and she had died under strange circumstances. Neighbors found her body in the basement after they realized they hadn't seen her for weeks. No one knew how she died, but rumors said she was odd, a little obsessed. I didn't tell Liza what I'd discovered, hoping it was just a coincidence and not wanting to fuel her fears. But each day her condition worsened. She said she felt touches when she was alone in a room, that someone was watching her through the walls. I didn't know how to help her, and then I started seeing things too. One night as I was climbing the stairs, I thought I saw a woman's figure in the darkness of the hallway. I froze, my heart pounding wildly. I stared into the darkness, but there was no one there. However, when I went to the mirror in the living room, I clearly saw fingerprints on its dusty surface, as if someone had run their hand across the glass. We tried to avoid being home during the day, leaving for work early and returning late, but every time night fell, the house swallowed us into its darkness. Liza became almost unrecognizable. Her face grew gaunt. Her eyes were always red from crying and lack of sleep. She started avoiding me as if she thought I was part of the threat. But the breaking point came one evening when I came home and found her standing at the entrance to the basement. She was holding a knife and muttering something under her breath. "Liza, what are you doing?" I tried to take the knife from her, but she pushed me away. "She says I have to leave, or else she'll take me." I grabbed her by the shoulders and tried to shake her out of it, but she broke free and screamed. It was a desperate scream filled with terror and pain. I stepped back in horror, not knowing what to do. She fell to her knees, pressing her hands to her ears as if trying to block out voices only she could hear. The next morning I couldn't take it anymore and called her parents, begging them to come and help. We decided that Liza would move in with them for a while to recover, but when they arrived, Liza refused to leave the house. She clung to the doorframe, screaming that if she left, she would come after her. Left alone, I tried to bring some order to the house to get rid of the things left by the previous owners. I went down to the basement and began sorting through boxes. Among the old belongings, I found a diary that belonged to Marina. I opened it randomly and saw pages filled with fear and madness. She wrote about feeling someone's presence in the house, that shadows wouldn't leave her in peace, that she was being forced to stay. The last entry was chilling. They say I will never leave, that now this is my home forever. I snapped the diary shut, feeling a cold grip tighten around my heart. When I returned to the living room, I saw Liza standing by the mirror again, staring at her reflection. But this time, I saw a flicker of fear in her eyes. "I can't stay here anymore," she whispered. I hugged her, and at that moment, we decided to leave the house for good.